Warsaw, 1944. Heroism, betrayal, and a fatal order. Every year, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 1st of August, Warsaw stops. Cars halt in the streets, buses pause, pedestrians stand still. Sirens rise above the modern city for 1 minute. For someone who does not know Polish history, the scene may look like a celebration of a battle. It is not. It is a moment in which an entire city remembers the people who were ordered to fight a battle that lasted 63 days, destroyed their capital, and ended with approximately 150,000 civilians dead. To understand the Warsaw Uprising, do not begin with generals leaning over maps. Begin with one young person leaving home. Imagine a 17-year-old courier putting a white and red armband into her pocket. Imagine a boy carrying medical dressings because there is no rifle for him. Imagine a mother watching her son walk down a staircase, knowing that Warsaw is about to rise, but not knowing whether she will ever see him again. There were tens of thousands of such departures. Every insurgent had a name. Every courier had a family. Every medic had a life that existed before the barricades. Every civilian killed beneath the ruins had once expected to grow old. That is why this episode will not be a patriotic ceremony translated into English. It will not pretend that every decision was wise merely because the people carrying out those decisions were courageous. And it will not repeat the communist lie that the insurgents were irresponsible criminals who destroyed their city. Two truths can exist at the same time. The men and women who fought in Warsaw displayed extraordinary courage. And the order that sent them into battle was a disastrous decision. The soldiers did not fail. The assumptions behind the order failed. One clarification for international viewers is essential. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 was not the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. The earlier revolt was the desperate Jewish armed resistance against the final destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. The uprising discussed today began more than a year later and was organized principally by the Polish Home Army, known in Polish as the Armia Krajowa, or AK. The Home Army was the main military force of the Polish underground state. It remained loyal to Poland's legal government in exile in London, rather than to the communist authorities being created under Soviet control. Its objective was not simply to remove German troops from Warsaw. It was to liberate the capital before the Red Army entered it, and to demonstrate that Poland still possessed its government, its army, and the right to determine its future. By the summer of 1944, Warsaw had endured almost 5 years of German occupation. Its residents had witnessed street executions, mass arrests, torture in Pawiak prison, forced labor, deportations, and the systematic murder of their Jewish neighbors. The city had seen the Warsaw Ghetto isolated, starved, burned, and destroyed. Young people grew up without ordinary schools, ordinary careers, or any certainty that they would survive the next police raid. For them, the underground state was not a historical curiosity. It was their real Poland. It organized secret education, courts, administration, intelligence, sabotage, and armed resistance. Its soldiers had trained for the moment when the occupation would weaken and open combat would become possible. By July 1944, that moment appeared to be approaching. The German Army Group Center had suffered a devastating defeat during the Soviet summer offensive. German units retreated through Warsaw. Officials temporarily fled. Residents heard artillery from the east. Soviet armored forces approached the Vistula. After years of terror, the possibility of liberation no longer looked imaginary. It appeared to be only days away. But Poland faced a second danger. The Red Army was advancing against Germany, but Stalin was not coming to restore the sovereign Polish Republic. He had already broken relations with the Polish government in London. He had authorized the creation of a rival communist administration. His security services regarded the Home Army not as a partner, but as an obstacle to Soviet control. This was the background to Operation Tempest. The Home Army planned to emerge from the underground as German forces withdrew, help defeat them, and then receive the approaching Soviets as the legitimate armed representatives of the Polish state. The concept had already been tested in cities such as Vilnius and Lviv. Polish units fought alongside the Red Army against Germany. Once the fighting ended, Soviet forces disarmed the Home Army, arrested officers, and pressured ordinary soldiers to join formations controlled by Moscow. The political warning was unmistakable. Stalin would accept Polish assistance against the Germans. He would not accept an independent Polish authority standing behind that assistance. Warsaw, therefore, became the center of a desperate political calculation. If the Home Army liberated the capital before Soviet troops entered, representatives of the legal Polish government could greet the Red Army as hosts rather than as powerless petitioners. The Polish flag would already be flying. The underground administration would already be functioning. The world would see that Poland had not been liberated into existence by Stalin. It had liberated itself. The intention was understandable. The military foundation was catastrophically weak. As late as the 14th of July, the Home Army commander, General Tadeusz Bor-Komorowski, wrote that an uprising had very little chance of success against German buildings transformed into fortified positions. Yet within days, the political urgency increased. General Leopold Okulicki became one of the strongest advocates of fighting in Warsaw. He believed that taking the capital before the Soviets arrived would force Moscow to make a visible choice: recognize the Polish underground authorities or destroy them before the eyes of the world. That was the heart of the plan. The uprising was not primarily conceived as a battle capable of defeating Germany independently. It was designed as an armed political demonstration performed between two advancing totalitarian powers. That should already trouble us. An army can use force to achieve a political objective, but political symbolism cannot replace ammunition, intelligence, communications, or coordination. The Home Army Command had no operational agreement with the Red Army. It had no reliable knowledge of Soviet plans. It had no guarantee that Western aircraft could provide meaningful support. It had insufficient anti-tank weapons, almost no heavy artillery, and no air force. Only a fraction of the soldiers expected to mobilize could begin the battle with a firearm. The commanders estimated that they might hold the city for several days, perhaps a week, until Soviet troops arrived. London was informed late and was given little opportunity to influence the final preparations. Jan Nowak Jezioransky, a courier arriving from the west, warned that substantial Allied assistance should not be expected. The warning did not stop the decision. On the morning of the 31st of July, the senior command remained divided. The immediate commander of Home Army forces in Warsaw, Antony Kruszczyl, known by the codename Monter, initially argued against beginning at once. He knew that his units were desperately short of weapons, and that German resistance had recovered from the temporary confusion visible in the streets. Another meeting was scheduled for the evening. Then Monter returned with dramatic news. He reported that Soviet armored troops had entered Praga, the eastern district of Warsaw, and that German defenses were collapsing. The report was premature. Soviet formations had advanced close to Warsaw, but German armored forces were counterattacking near Radzimin and Wołomin. One Soviet tank corps was in serious danger, and Red Army commanders were already preparing to regroup defensively. Komorowski did not wait for full verification. After consulting leading officers and the government delegate, he gave the order. The uprising would begin at 5 o'clock on the following afternoon. This may be the most decisive moment in the entire story. The decision was not made because the commanders believed the Home Army could defeat the Germans alone. It was made because they believed the Germans were breaking, the Soviets were arriving, and the window for a political demonstration was about to close. All three assumptions were wrong. The German defense had not collapsed. The Red Army did not immediately enter Warsaw, and the political demonstration did not compel Stalin to recognize an independent Poland. This was not hope supporting a plan. It was hope being used in place of a plan. What then did the ordinary insurgents know? They knew they had received an order from the army to which they had sworn allegiance. They knew Soviet artillery could be heard. They had heard Moscow radio encouraging Warsaw to take up arms against the Germans. They saw German columns moving through the city. They had trained for years for exactly such a moment. Many had been led to believe that the fighting would be short and that outside help was near. They were not in a position to inspect intelligence reports, interrogate Soviet operational intentions, or evaluate conversations between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. That is how military hierarchy works. A soldier is entitled to assume that a lawful order to launch a citywide uprising rests on information and planning unavailable to the rank and file. This is why I am careful with the statement that the soldiers were lied to. We cannot prove that every commander knowingly told a deliberate falsehood, but we can say something nearly as serious. Thousands of young people were sent into battle without being shown the full uncertainty surrounding Soviet assistance, Western support, and the actual situation east of the Vistula. They were encouraged to believe that liberation was close. The command had no guarantee that it was. Moscow added to that expectation. On the 29th of July, Soviet radio broadcast an appeal calling on Warsaw to rise against the Germans. The message did not create the Home Army's decision, and it did not place Stalin in command of the uprising. But it helped create the atmosphere in which immediate action seemed both necessary and supported. Within weeks, Stalin would denounce the same struggle as a criminal adventure. At 5 o'clock on the 1st of August, the city exploded into battle. Mobilization was incomplete. The order had been issued with little time for units to assemble. Weapons were hidden across the city, and some could not be retrieved before fighting began. Men and women arrived at collection points to discover that there was no gun for them. Some carried grenades, petrol bottles, medical supplies, or nothing more than the white and red armband of the underground army. Against them stood German forces with fortified positions, machine guns, artillery, armored vehicles, and control of key bridges, railway lines, airports, and government buildings. Yet the insurgents achieved far more than the imbalance of weapons suggested was possible. They captured large areas of the city. They raised Polish flags. They built barricades. They seized German weapons and vehicles. They created hospitals, kitchens, workshops, postal services, and newspapers. The underground state emerged into daylight. Radio Błyskawica began broadcasting to Warsaw and to the outside world. Women served not only as nurses and couriers, but also as soldiers, communication specialists, and commanders. Teenagers carried messages through fire. Children helped extinguish flames and deliver food, although their presence in battle remains one of the most painful symbols of the uprising. The insurgents captured the past telephone building after bitter fighting. The Zoshka battalion liberated the German concentration camp at Genshuvka and freed 348 Jewish prisoners. Many of the liberated men joined the fight. Jewish survivors of the destroyed ghetto also took part, some under Polish names, some in separate units, and some within communist formations. For a brief period, in districts controlled by the uprising, the Polish Republic existed again. Not as a speech, not as an exile government in London, as streets, offices, courts, newspapers, soldiers, and civilians operating beneath the Polish flag. That achievement was real. It deserves recognition. The uprising was not a farce, and its participants were not incapable romantics. They showed discipline, ingenuity, and courage under conditions few modern audiences can imagine. But courage can overcome a machine gun position. It cannot, by itself, correct a failed strategic calculation. The German response was not limited to defeating armed resistance. Heinrich Himmler ordered Warsaw destroyed and its population killed. Beginning on the 5th of August, German SS, police, and auxiliary formations carried out mass murder in the district of Wola. Men, women, and children were dragged from homes, hospitals, and workshops and shot in groups. Patients were murdered in their beds. Medical staff were killed beside them. Buildings filled with civilians were set on fire. Between the 5th and the 7th of August alone, approximately 40,000 people may have been murdered in Wola. Similar crimes took place in Ochota and elsewhere. The purpose was terror. The Germans intended to break the uprising by demonstrating that every district resisting them would be punished through the extermination of its civilian population. This is why discussions about whether the uprising was justified cannot be separated from the people who never made the decision. An elderly woman in Wola did not vote for an insurrection. A hospital patient did not approve Operation Tempest. A child did not assess the position of Soviet tank armies. Yet they paid for the decision with their lives. The responsibility for their murder belongs to the German perpetrators. Nothing about the uprising excuses the crimes committed by Nazi Germany. But saying that the Germans were responsible for the murders does not remove the obligation to ask whether Polish commanders had realistically assessed the consequences for civilians. Moral responsibility is not a cake divided into portions. The murderer is responsible for murder. The commander is responsible for the decision to expose a city to a battle he cannot control. Both judgments can be true without becoming equivalent. And then there was Stalin. Did the Soviet Union directly cooperate with the Germans in crushing the uprising? We must be precise. There is no strong evidence of a formal, joint German-Soviet military operation against Warsaw's insurgents. Red Army soldiers did not enter the city to fight alongside the Wehrmacht. But formal cooperation was unnecessary. Stalin could assist the destruction of the independent Polish underground simply by ensuring that meaningful help did not arrive. First, the military situation. The Red Army had advanced an enormous distance during its summer offensive. Supply lines were stretched. Units were exhausted. The German armored counterattack east of Warsaw was real and temporarily successful. It is therefore too simple to say that Soviet armies could have captured Warsaw immediately, but stopped only because Stalin ordered them to watch the city die. Operational difficulties existed. But those difficulties do not explain the political obstruction that followed. The Soviet government refused to coordinate with the Home Army. It labeled the uprising an irresponsible adventure. Soviet security forces continued disarming and arresting Home Army units elsewhere in Poland, including formations that might otherwise have reinforced the capital. Most importantly, Stalin initially refused permission for British and American aircraft supplying Warsaw to land at Soviet airfields after completing their missions. That decision mattered enormously. Without access to Soviet bases, Allied aircraft had to fly from southern Italy across vast stretches of enemy-controlled territory, reach burning Warsaw, drop supplies with limited accuracy, and then attempt the entire journey back. The risks were enormous. The losses were severe. The American ambassador in Moscow, Averell Harriman, concluded that the Soviet refusal could be explained only by ruthless political considerations. The United States Secretary of State warned Roosevelt that Moscow had apparently reversed an earlier promise to help and opposed British and American efforts to supply the uprising. Stalin did not need to give the Germans ammunition. He only needed to prevent the Allies from delivering ammunition to the Poles. The political logic was obvious. If the Germans destroyed the Home Army in Warsaw, Stalin would lose nothing. Germany would spend men and ammunition eliminating the largest independent Polish military and political center. The surviving city would be exhausted. The underground administration loyal to London would be shattered. When the Soviets eventually entered, they would face ruins rather than a functioning Polish authority capable of challenging communist rule. Stalin did not create the German atrocities, but he understood the advantage they gave him, and he refused to act in ways that might have saved the political force he intended to suppress after the war. There was eventually some assistance from the Soviet side. Soviet aircraft made limited drops later in the uprising. In September, soldiers of the Soviet-backed First Polish Army attempted to cross the Vistula and support the defenders of Chernihiv. Those soldiers fought courageously, and many died. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. But it came late, was poorly coordinated, and did not represent the major Soviet intervention the uprising had expected. The existence of limited aid does not erase the earlier obstruction. It indicates that assistance was physically possible when Moscow chose to permit it. Different armies used different methods. The Germans destroyed the Home Army in Warsaw through fire, bombardment, and mass murder. Soviet forces elsewhere disarmed and arrested Home Army units they regarded as political enemies. There was no formal alliance between them in this operation, but the same independent Polish movement was being eliminated from two directions. And what of the Western Allies? The usual answer is that Britain and the United States were powerless. That is not entirely true. They could not order Stalin to help. They were not prepared to begin a war with the Soviet Union over Warsaw. Their aircraft could not magically erase distance, weather, and German air defenses. But powerlessness and unwillingness are not the same thing. British, Polish, and South African crews flew supply missions from Italy. They crossed enemy territory at night, navigated toward a burning city, and descended through searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. Some crews never returned. According to the Imperial War Museums, 41 aircraft were lost, and 263 Allied airmen died during the supply operations. These men were not indifferent to Warsaw. They paid for the attempt with their lives. Their courage should not be confused with the caution of the governments directing the war. Winston Churchill repeatedly pressed Stalin for cooperation. He warned Roosevelt that the fall of Warsaw would destroy the position of Polish Prime Minister Stanisław Mikołajczyk and undermine any hope of a political settlement. Churchill even proposed that American aircraft carry out the operation and land at Soviet airfields without formal permission, confronting Stalin with a completed action rather than another request. Roosevelt would not accept that risk. The American president valued the alliance with the Soviet Union as essential to defeating Germany. He also hoped for Soviet participation in the war against Japan and for Stalin's cooperation in the future international order. Warsaw was important. Preserving the Grand Alliance was more significant. That was the calculation. Roosevelt and Churchill sent Stalin a joint appeal on the 20th of August, warning how world opinion would react if Warsaw's anti-Nazi fighters were abandoned. They asked him to drop supplies or permit Allied aircraft to use Soviet facilities. It was an appeal, not an ultimatum. No major consequence was attached to refusal. No portion of Allied cooperation was openly made conditional on assistance. The West protested. It did not confront. Could stronger pressure have saved the uprising? We cannot know. Threatening aid to the Soviet Union might not have changed Stalin's policy. Landing aircraft without permission could have produced a dangerous crisis. More drops might still have arrived too late or fallen into German hands. Historical honesty requires admitting uncertainty, but it also requires rejecting the claim that nothing more could even have been attempted. The Western Allies were not entirely powerless. They were unwilling to spend the political capital, military risk, and unity of the anti-German alliance that stronger action would have required. They could pressure Stalin. They could not command him. And when pressure threatened the alliance, they chose the alliance over Warsaw. Eventually, Soviet permission was granted for one major American shuttle mission. On the 18th of September, more than 100 American B-17 bombers appeared over Warsaw and dropped 1,284 containers of weapons, food, and medical supplies. The sight of the aircraft created a moment of extraordinary hope. But the drop came high and late. No more than 288 containers may have reached Polish hands. Some estimates are lower. Most landed in German-controlled territory. A second large American mission was not approved. The scale of the operation demonstrated what Allied air power could produce. Its timing demonstrated the cost of political delay. By September, the uprising was no longer a battle for the liberation of the entire city. It was a struggle between shrinking islands of resistance. The old town had been pulverized. Its surviving defenders escaped through the sewers. Czerniaków became a killing ground, as Polish forces attempted to maintain contact with troops crossing from the eastern bank. Mokotów fell. Żoliborz fell. Hospitals lacked medicine. Civilians searched for water beneath bombardment. People lived in cellars as the buildings above them burned. The sewer system became a road, an evacuation route, and a tomb. Some fighters spent hours moving through darkness, filth, and poisonous air, forbidden to speak because German troops might hear them through manholes. The uprising had been planned for several days. It continued for 63. On the 2nd of October, the Home Army signed the capitulation agreement. After considerable pressure, Germany agreed to treat captured insurgents as prisoners of war, rather than execute them as bandits. For civilians, there was no return to ordinary life. The surviving population was expelled. Many were sent through the transit camp at Pruszków. Some were deported for forced labor. Others were sent to concentration camps. Then Germany began to destroy the empty capital systematically. Special units looted buildings, burned neighborhoods, and blew up structures of historical and cultural importance. The royal castle, libraries, archives, churches, palaces, and residential streets were reduced to rubble. By the time Soviet and Soviet-controlled Polish forces entered Warsaw on the 17th of January 1945, the city was largely dead. More than 70% of its residential buildings and around 90% of its historic architecture had been destroyed. Broader calculations placed the total destruction of the city's pre-war fabric even higher. The human losses resist perfect calculation. Estimates differ because people disappeared beneath ruins, were executed without records, or died after evacuation. Approximately 16,000 to 18,000 insurgents were killed. Civilian deaths are commonly estimated between 150,000 and 180,000, with some assessments reaching higher. Hundreds of thousands were driven from the city. Among the dead were school children, university students, poets, engineers, doctors, teachers, artists, and future leaders who would never reach adulthood. It is tempting to summarize them as the lost flower of the Polish nation. But even that phrase turns individuals into a symbol. They were not valuable merely because they might have become an elite. Their lives had value before anyone knew what profession they might choose. Who benefited? Germany gained a temporary military victory and carried out its vengeance against the city that had resisted occupation. Stalin gained the removal of a major independent Polish force. The Soviet Union entered Warsaw after the Home Army had been defeated, the underground administration shattered, and the population expelled. The uprising did not cause communist rule in Poland. Stalin intended to dominate the country regardless of what happened in Warsaw. The Red Army occupied Polish territory. The Western powers had already accepted realities that gave Moscow enormous control over Central and Eastern Europe. But the destruction of the Home Army's Warsaw structures made Soviet domination easier. A generation capable of organizing independent resistance had been killed, dispersed, or imprisoned. A functioning alternative to communist authority had been physically broken. The capital into which the Soviet-backed government entered was not a liberated political center. It was a field of ruins. Defenders of the decision to begin the uprising make serious arguments. They point out that Warsaw was close to spontaneous explosion. Young soldiers had waited for years. Communist radio was calling for battle. German authorities had issued demands for large numbers of civilians to report for fortification work, raising fears of mass roundups or the evacuation of the city. They argue that doing nothing would have allowed Stalin to claim that the Home Army had hidden while the Red Army liberated Poland. They argue that no commander on the 31st of July possessed the knowledge available to historians today. All of that is true. The decision was made under occupation, with incomplete intelligence, under extreme time pressure, and fearing both Germany and the Soviet Union. It was not made by comfortable men casually sacrificing a city for theatrical glory. Many commanders understood that Poland's independence might be disappearing before their eyes. But understanding the desperation does not require approving the decision. The purpose of command is to resist emotion when emotion demands an action the army cannot sustain. The greater the courage of the soldiers, the greater the responsibility of the commanders who spend it. A political objective does not become militarily achievable because the alternative is humiliating. An uprising against a retreating enemy may be rational when liberation forces are coordinated and approaching. An uprising against a still organized German garrison, without heavy weapons, without control of bridges or airfields, without agreement with the Red Army, and without guaranteed Allied support, was something else. It was a gamble in which Warsaw itself became the stake. My conclusion is therefore clear. The order should not have been given. The greatest strategic mistake of the Warsaw Uprising was that it began. That conclusion does not dishonor the insurgents. It places responsibility where responsibility belongs. The ordinary fighter did not choose the intelligence. The courier did not control diplomacy. The medic did not decide whether Stalin would open his airfields. The boy with a petrol bottle did not determine Roosevelt's priorities. They obeyed the underground state they believed represented free Poland. Many understood that they might die. Most could not have known that the battle would last 63 days and that the promised arrival of decisive help would never come. Some people fear that criticizing the decision will weaken national memory. I believe the opposite. A memory that survives only through idealization is fragile. The insurgents do not need us to invent a victory for them. They do not need us to pretend that the city's destruction was strategically necessary in order for their courage to matter. They deserve a memory strong enough to contain tragedy. They deserve to be remembered as people who created hospitals in cellars, as nurses who crossed streets under machine gun fire, as couriers who memorized routes through collapsing districts, as soldiers who attacked tanks with bottles and improvised explosives, as civilians who shared the last water from a bucket, as Jewish prisoners who walked out of Genshówka and chose to fight alongside those who had freed them, as priests, doctors, engineers, scouts, workers, students, and children, trapped inside a decision larger than any one of them. They deserve gratitude without mythology, honor without censorship, admiration without the demand that we call catastrophe victory. The commanders must be judged separately. Stalin must be judged separately. The German murderers must be judged separately. The Western governments that calculated their priorities must be judged separately. History becomes dishonest when all of those responsibilities are merged into one sacred story in which questioning the order is treated as an attack on the dead. It is not. The dead cannot be protected by hiding the truth. At 5 o'clock on the 1st of August, Warsaw will stop again. The sirens will sound. People will stand beside reconstructed buildings in a city that rose from destruction. For 1 minute, the modern capital will become silent. When that happens, we should not honor a military decision. We should honor the people who had to live and die with its consequences. The Warsaw insurgents fought with extraordinary courage. Nazi Germany answered them with extermination. Stalin encouraged resistance when it suited Soviet propaganda, obstructed assistance when independent Poland became inconvenient, and entered the ruins when the political obstacle had been removed. British and Allied air crews risked everything to help. Churchill protested. Roosevelt calculated. The West chose the larger alliance. Warsaw fought alone. The heroes were not the ones who failed. They were the ones who carried an impossible order for 63 days. They do not need comforting lies from us. They deserve something harder. They deserve the truth. And they deserve to be remembered. One life, one name, and one unfinished future at a time. This was OllieKayPolitical. Thank you for listening.